If you've been following along with the channel for any length of time, you know that I've frequently said that I believe that the next couple of years in tech are going to be incredibly interesting. The next generation consoles launched by the holiday season of this year, and AMD and Nvidia will both be launching next generation GPUs. For AMD, this will be particularly exciting because they'll finally have high-end cards to compete with Nvidia, but also support hardware-based ray tracing too. Moreover, there's lots of interesting launches on the CPU side of the equation as well as platforms, with Zen 3 launching hopefully later this year as well. But moreover, the software side of things is also extremely interesting, and with SSDs becoming prevalent on the PC and of course part and parcel of the next generation consoles, I believe that developers will be empowered to achieve things that were just impossible with the current generation of hardware and current ways of thinking. As computer technology evolves, graphics improve, new gameplay experiences become possible. And this has been a consistent theme throughout both console and PC hardware. 8 to 16-bit era saw sprites grow bigger, more colourful, tons more animation, only for 3D to burst into the scene with games such as Mario 64 and Metal Gear Solid redefining gaming. Not just in terms of their visuals, but also in terms of the complexity of their gameplay. You see, there's been a lot of articles popping up recently that this next generation of consoles and hardware for PCs would not offer a significant leap in visual quality. Instead, it would perhaps be disappointing compared to what we've seen with previous generations of hardware. But here's the thing, this is nothing new. This argument has been consistent, and we've seen the same arguments popping up each new generation of hardware. I think few people would say that PlayStation 4 games or Xbox games have not improved over their predecessors. Look at a game like, say, Final Fantasy VII. I don't think anyone would argue that the PlayStation 3 was capable of that. But also, it's imperative to remember that as developers get used to hardware, they can squeeze more and more out of the machine. Think of it this way, the PS3 and its cell processor are fantastic examples of this. Do you remember when we saw games like Uncharted 1 and how Naughty Dog slowly got to grips with the weird architecture of the PS3, and then how Uncharted 2, 3, and then finally Last of Us came to the machine? Honestly, it almost seems like Last of Us just had no right to run on the PS3, especially if you were to compare it directly to Uncharted 1. Who would have thought that it would even be possible? It almost looks like it's running on an entirely different generation. This next generation will be interesting because the hardware is so powerful for both machines and of course upcoming PC hardware in terms of, yes, raw pixel pushing power, but will also shift the thought process of how games can and will be created. Limitations which have been part of game design will just be removed, and richer, more diverse and interactive worlds with way more assets, and just as importantly, does not eat up a ridiculous amount of development time to achieve these specific effects are on the horizon. For this video, I want to be as platform agnostic as possible. After all, much of what I'm about to say is going to be applicable for all platforms. But with Unreal Engine 5, we've seen it demoed thus far on a PlayStation 5 development kit. To my understanding, it was an early development kit and not necessarily reflective of final production hardware. Nevertheless, what we've seen is tantalizing to say the least. But UE5 is designed to run on, well, just about everything. There are some caveats. The PC, for example, to see a demo such as what we saw with UE5 for the PS5, well, most likely you're going to need a fairly beefy GPU, ideally something like a 2070 Super from what Epic have said, and, well, as for drives, yeah, ideally NVMe to be able to just feed in the vast amounts of data that is being thrown around here by the demo. Here, we're not talking about them thar flops, as while raw FP32 performance is great, it doesn't tackle everything there is to see about the next generation. Instead, we're looking at a fundamental shift and methodology in the technology which is part of the system. More CPU cores, faster GPUs, and of course, more efficiency, and new technology such as hardware-based ray tracing, lots more memory, and, just as importantly, significantly more bandwidth, and perhaps the linchpin of all of this, SSD technology. The announcement of Unreal Engine 5 essentially broke the internet, with much discussion over the various facets of hardware features of the next generation. We can actually get quite a few glimpses of important advances in this demo, and a great understanding of why the move to the next generation of consoles, and of course PC hardware, is going to be so awesome for us gamers, but also games developers. And make no mistake about it, developers having access to easier tools and better development environments is only going to be a good thing for us, especially in a development world filled with crunch and ever bigger projects. As a quick refresher, the previous generation had two major components holding them back: CPU and storage. The CPU was, well, made even worse because audio had to be processed on the CPU cores. The next generation have, of course, their own dedicated audio blocks. Faster CPUs do allow for higher frame rates, up to 120 FPS is being touted at the moment, but it also provides developers access to a great deal more power to achieve richer and more detailed game worlds. While the GPU draws stuff on screen and also handles things like advanced physics work, such as destruction of a wall or something else intensive, which could be offloaded to the GPU as a compute command, the CPU is responsible for actually understanding what the game system needs to do, and driving the whole thing by issuing commands to the GPU, as well as handling game logic and, well, just about everything else. This will also translate very well to PCs, as honestly, not many games currently push higher core count processors to their limits. I recently tested this out with the help of Intel and MSI in a core count test scaling video, featuring a 9900K and several different APIs. Most games don't really benefit from a ton of threads available. This will, however, change quickly with the next generation titles being on the market in a year or two, and it'll be fun to revisit this in the future with the then current hardware. Meanwhile, the other element of the next generation consoles are SSDs, which hold the data of the game, of course. There are two ways for SSDs to improve performance. The first is raw throughput, that is the sheer amount of data being thrown into the system, and the second is access times, i.e. how long a piece of data takes to be nabbed by the system. A traditional drive is a thin magnetic disk spinning around a lot, the base speed of the RPM of the drive, and a mechanical head finds the data on the disk and accesses it, and of course then puts it into the system. So, what happens if you need a piece of data that's located in a different location to another? Well, too bad, you'll have to wait for the disk to access that data. This is a reason install sizes are so big for modern games. Basically, not only are the files larger for modern games because larger textures and so on, but they're also frequently repeated on the drive to reduce loading times and, of course, streaming times. PCs will likely need to adopt this technology as well. Larger RAM pools may be a thing in next-generation PC games, but I wouldn't be surprised if NVMe SSDs start to become recommended for PC users who wish to push the highest detail settings. Epic have stated UE5 can run pretty well on a 2070 Super with the PS5 demo, but this is with a fast NVMe SSD to feed the system. This is not with that clunky 1TB 7200 RPM drive that's been with you for the last several system upgrades. I do want to keep this video as simple as possible, but think of it this way. Games do not load everything into RAM when the level starts. Data is streamed in and out of the disk. Games can actually dedicate a section of memory for streaming assets, and naturally, this is where the infamous walking and talking sections can happen in games, or when you're forced to move through winding corridors where angles perfectly block what's visible on the other side so you don't see things literally loading in. Really and truly, with current limitations of disk I/O, this leaves developers with a few choices on how to pull data into RAM fast enough. The first are those obligatory walking and talking sections / narrow corridors that you need to squeeze past. Your character is, say, slightly injured, maybe they twist their ankle, disorientated, whatever. This is all in an effort for data to load. Naturally, some of this is also for plot purposes, but it's certainly a benefit for games developers. Another option is to limit the speed that you can traverse. This is particularly true in open world games. Or you could limit the amount you can view simultaneously. We've already seen the semi-leaked Spider-Man demo. A journalist basically put it online, so you can kind of say it's leaked, but this dates back to last year. This was Spider-Man on the PS4, but running on essentially very early PS5 hardware with an SSD, and you can see yourself the differences on how fast Spider-Man can travel around the city. Basically, data with the PS4 Pro was limited. Spider-Man was running, or shall I say moving as fast as he could through the city, because otherwise the system literally could not keep up with him. But with PS5 hardware, this is not the same thing. You can make him traverse around the city much faster. So imagine, for example, a Superman game with this type of behaviour. Of course, obscuring objects and other details of the city by big buildings also helps a lot here as well with the PS4 version. And we also saw I/O issues with other games too. Batman Arkham Knight was, well, pretty infamous on consoles, but also even on the PC. It could really tax performance with stuttering, especially with higher quality textures. You could mitigate this with even a SATA SSD and a larger pool of RAM, especially on the GPU. 8GB cards were not too common back then, but if you did have, say, an R9 390 or something like that, it would actually give you better performance quite frequently. Anyway, think of this. Access times and throughput could be really thought of as acceleration and top speed in car terms, respectively. This is a very rough analogy, but imagine a car which could travel at 200 miles an hour. You may be extremely excited by that prospect, but imagine if it also took 5 minutes to accelerate and 5 minutes to brake, and cornering was just, let's say, sucks. Let's use the word suck. How practical would that be? Well, of course, in the odd scenario, it might be exciting or interesting, but on average, it wouldn't really be that useful. But imagine if you also had a car which could accelerate to 30 miles an hour in only 1 second. But that's its top speed. Again, not practical. Could be cool in some limited scenarios, but it's not something that ultimately would be that useful overall. SSDs are the same then. Increase the speed data is accessed, but we also need to be able to pull it extremely fast with high throughput into system memory. Basically, not only do you need to pull a lot of data from the system with a fast NVMe drive, but you also need to be able to access small, non-consecutive data, i.e. data that's in different portions of the disk and may be very small in size, and that is critical as well. Unreal Engine 5 is also still in development. Epic states it will not launch until next year. So, given the nature of UE, this will allow developers to tinker with it and explore the fundamental technology. There have been 2 pieces of technology heavily demoed with UE5, Lumen and Nanite. We'll get to those in a moment. But ultimately, UE5 is designed to be scalable and malleable across different scenarios. If you're designing a 2D retro action platformer, okay, no problem. Building a fighting game like Tekken, okay, no problem. And are you, yes, you, designing a third-person game to show the world that they don't need Bloodborne 2 because, well, you've got their back. Your team will give them what you need. Well, I've got good news for you, because you guessed it. Yep, UE5, you're good there too. Let's talk about the elephant in the room with PCs first, and that is the standardization of SSDs in consoles. Sure, PCs have had access to SSDs for years and years now. A game developer, though, has been held back for a few reasons. One, it's not standard on all PCs, i.e. well, mechanical drives are still a thing, and current generation console drives are so slow, you might as well send out a carrier pigeon. I'll explore this in a greater detail in other videos. I'll try to remember to link it in the description. But long story short, no one really knows how SSDs becoming standard on consoles will impact PCs in the long run. At a guess, we will use the specs of Microsoft's Flight Simulator to give you one idea of how it will go. Higher quality gameplay, or rather settings, will require at least some form of SSD in the system, and ideally more RAM than 16GB, so 32 will probably become a standard. I don't think that's unreasonable though by, let's say, end of next year. Furthermore, NVMe SSDs and their sizes will also become more reasonable. Of course, software, thanks to Microsoft, is also going to be much more supportive of this technology, such as DirectX 12 Ultimate and its sampler feedback technology. Ultimately, the problem is then that PCs up until now haven't 100% benefited with the technology, because even if you do have an SSD in your system, yes, loading is faster, but the game itself is not coded to take advantage of an SSD. And this is much the same, of course, if you plonk an SSD inside your PlayStation 4 Pro. It loads faster, but it's not anywhere near as big of a deal or big of a jump as what we'll see with the PS5 using it. Anyway, let's talk about some of the technology in UE and why all of this nonsense of games not improving visually and just in general is, well, I guess I just said it, didn't I? Nonsense. At the heart of UE5, there's two driving pieces of technology, at least that's what's been shown off so far. Without any question, there is other technology, but Epic just have not shown it off yet. We'll tackle Lumen first because, well, it's my video and I want to. If I were writing an elevator pitch for Lumen, I would say that you take global illumination and you make it fully dynamic, able to adjust to events happening in the in-game world, such as, let's say, the ceiling collapsing in the demo, as opposed to baked-in and static GI, which we've seen in games for years now. Lumen does use a form of ray tracing, but it's a software solution, at least that's been what's shown here, and it's designed to run across a wider range of hardware. If you've been following either the next generation consoles for the last year or you've had any form of contact with PC gaming, you'll be familiar with ray tracing. Hardware-based ray tracing looks, well, amazing. It allows titles like Minecraft RTX to look like this, Quake 2 RTX to look like this, although technically this is path tracing, which is a way more complicated form of hardware-based ray tracing. We'll go into path tracing and RTX technology in a separate video, which I'm working on, but for now, just know that the next notch down for this is hybrid ray tracing. This is where the whole scene is not crafted with ray tracing, but instead uses RT technology in conjunction with traditional rasterization graphics. Essentially, RT here is used to, say, improve the interaction of light and shadows in a scene. Naturally, this changes our perception of realism. With Nvidia's technology, rays are sent shooting off into the scene, and then how those rays bounce around in a scene is calculated, and then used to predict how light would interact with a game world, or shadows, or, well, lots of other stuff. This has several benefits. The first is it allows objects and light sources which are outside of screen space, for simplicity, think your point of view, to impact what's going on in the game world in terms of, let's say, lighting or shadows. Light can also bounce to multiple surfaces as well. If you have a glass desk with a glass cup half filled with coffee, and say a stack of papers off to the side, light would interact between the table, the papers and the cup. Of course, also, the liquid inside the cup would change how light interacts with the cup, changing the reflection on both the cup itself as well as the table, and the reflections you would see in the overall scene. I'll go deeper, as I said, into this in another video, but long story short, this is taxing on the GPU. Real-time ray tracing noms up GPU resources, but Nvidia's Turing architecture introduced dedicated hardware, RT cores, to calculate the bouncing of these rays. Now understand very clearly, this is not the RT cores handling all work associated with ray tracing. Instead, they handle bounding volume hierarchy (BVH) calculations and other such work. In other words, what happens to the light and how the light interacts with the scene. But to keep things simple, the actual rendering of this, that's left down to Nvidia's Turing architecture. Now, RDNA 2 for AMD works similarly. We've got patents, although the actual implementation of the ray tracing cores is a bit different. You can see public patents for AMD's solution. And while, as I said, the design is a bit different to Turing, and Turing will also be superseded by Ampere, which is Nvidia's next generation of cards, still, the RT cores of RDNA 2 figure out how rays bounce around the scene, but it's still down to the shaders on each compute unit to work out what to do with this information. I'm very much simplifying this, but think of it this way. This is where Microsoft's 13 T-flops of RT performance figure came from. They are not wrong if BVH calculations were only done on the GPU and not the ray tracing cores. You would need an additional 13 T-flops just to handle ray tracing intersect testing, in other words BVH. That is not to say that the RT cores, though, can do anything else when they are doing this work. This is all they do, BVH. So this is not to say that the Xbox GPU is 12.1 T-flops and an additional 13. It's 12.1 with the RT cores doing the equivalent work of 13 T-flops. Also, to be clear, the PS5 uses RDNA's to approach for BVH calculations, but the Xbox, thanks to more compute units, can handle more intersections compared to the Sony. The thing here is that the Xbox GPU runs at a slower speed. Essentially, each compute unit then can handle fewer intersections than Sony's. Now, normally we'd be heavily guessing as to the performance differential between them in terms of ray tracing, but Microsoft have actually got our backs here. I wonder if AMD actually wanted to kick their shin for revealing this information of RDNA 2, but during the Eurogamer drill down, Microsoft's engineers confirmed 380 billion intersections a second. This is obviously peak, and also there's 52 compute units with the Xbox versus 36, and of course we all know the clock frequency difference as well. Long story short, per compute unit performance is around 8.9 billion-ish for the PS5, and the Xbox is 7.3. Notice there's no ish though for the Xbox because of the fixed frequency. According to Sony and my own digging, PS5's clock speed should only go down on the GPU a few percent on average under heavy CPU workloads, but these loads will typically last only a few frames, way less than the 1 second measurement that we're talking about here. AMD have confirmed that SmartShift can operate in as little as 2 milliseconds, diverting power from the CPU to the GPU as needed. But this tallies up very well with what I was told about the PlayStation 5 and how its implementation also operates. I've gone into this before in a couple of news videos, but long story short, a PS VR game ideally would be hitting 120 frames a second, which is around 8 milliseconds per frame, and I was told that power can shift multiple times in that time frame, in other words 8 milliseconds. I want to be a worst case scenario kind of guy, so let's say that the workload does go down for an entire second by more than 1, perhaps even 2%, and that they also take the value of the highest clocks as well, so we've got that range. So let's say 8.7 to 8.9 billion intersections for the PlayStation 5 versus 7.3 billion for the Xbox Series X. So using Microsoft's figures, we have 380 billion versus 321.4, best case of the PS5, or 314-ish of the PS5. That's all, once again, using worst case figures. So this should mean that Microsoft has a nice ray tracing advantage, with the GPU hitting more rays a second it can generate, but those rays can also in turn bounce to fewer targets. I will also say that these figures cannot be compared against Nvidia's Turing giga-rays figure. They're not measuring the same thing. I want to keep things simple, but just don't compare the two. With Lumen then, things are a bit different, as it does not use hardware-based ray tracing. Those features have already been present in UE4 beta versions, which developers have had access to, and so UE5's Lumen is a software-based solution running on compute commands. It can also be thought as a step back in terms of visual quality compared to what hybrid based pixel ray tracing can achieve with games like Control or Shadow of the Tomb Raider. With Control, which uses RTX technology, light is calculated on essentially pixel by pixel basis, or lots of rays can be thrown into the scene. Long story short, it's less performance intensive than full scene path tracing, but it's also not light on computational performance. So here we have this other method. It's less accurate than per pixel RT found in Control, or at least less flexible, but it uses a lot less performance. How much less performance is another question, but it does depend A on the scene, B on the hardware. Unfortunately, without demos running the exact same configuration, with the only difference being what lighting method is used, drawing a comparison is just not possible right now. So essentially, Lumen is real-time global illumination. It's designed to either replace or augment traditional lighting techniques that we've seen in the past, such as traditional lighting and shadow calculations, which are done by the artist and then baked into the scene, meaning they're not running in real time, static. This is contrary to Lumen, which uses three distinct different techniques of calculating lighting, depending on the object. Screen space traces handle the smaller object, such as debris you see in these scenes. Meshed sign distance field handle the larger objects in your vision. And finally, voxel traces take care of the really big stuff, such as a huge wall that's looming in the horizon. As you can imagine, each of these techniques has different amount of GPU grunt that it needs to achieve. And just like level of detail, say geometry, the further you are away from an object, the less it contributes to a scene. Voxel traces are probably the easiest to explain, as they're basically large box-like constructs which exist in rough stand-ins up into those objects. And then, on the other end of the spectrum are the debris, which use screen space traces, which are accurately traced within screen space. Here, you can see how there is a small problem with the lighting of this scene. It has a slight latency associated with it. This is particularly noticeable if there are sudden changes in lighting, or if the camera angle quickly changes from one to another. Basically, occlusion from bounce lighting, to be clear. This means that light has been reflected from one surface onto other surfaces isn't present for just a few frames. This is not too noticeable at regular playback, but if your eye is looking for it, there are a few instances where it is more noticeable. Again, Lumen is a technology which runs without dedicated RT cores, just using the GPU shaders, and it's designed for lower impact on hardware. I do not have a crystal ball here. With what developers and what they end up doing, well, I suspect it will be a compelling mixture of multiple graphics techniques for next generation of gaming, using a smart combination of per pixel ray tracing combined with real-time GI, so developers can have their cake and eat it, so to speak. I would also imagine this is going to be incredibly important on consoles given their fixed performance budget, but it's not too difficult to assume that this is going to be critical on PCs as well. While there's been a lot of discussion on Lumen, it's worth noting that there are other forms of ray tracing as well. I've recently interviewed AdShare for their local ray technology, which can run on non-RTX cards on PC, and is also highly scalable, even down to mobile-like devices. As Unreal Engine 4 already has much of the real-time ray tracing support for both PC hardware and next-gen consoles, especially in UE4's betas, this is a new technique. And as always, it'll be down to developers to make decisions based on what effect they're trying to achieve, and of course, dealing with different performance budgets and targets. Switching to Nanite, it's technology which allows, quite frankly, a ludicrous amount of detail in polygonal models, but moreover, also saves lots of time for developers. In Epic's own blog detailing UE5, it claims that we could be looking at scenes generated with hundreds of millions or even billions of polygons. Of course, performance is still ultimately limited by the hardware it's running on, but assuming you've got sufficient amounts of grunt, well, you can just go ham. The workflow, though, is considerably easier. As I've just said, developers are able to essentially port models over from, say, ZBrush, a very popular modeling tool, and then bring them in engine. And with UE5's Nanite tech, they no longer have to worry about offering many versions of the same model with different LODs, so that, of course, they can account for different viewing angles and distances, and, of course, this would all come down to having to concern themselves with specific polygon budgets and with particular models. To borrow phrasing from Nvidia's Jensen Huang, albeit for their own ray tracing tech and not this, it just works. With Nanite, massive amounts of texture data can be thrown around the scene. Indeed, you can have up to 24 different 8K textures on one particular statue, at least according to Epic themselves. This means that there is a significant amount of detail that you can add into it, but also this is not really a level of detail cutoff where you can see popping. Basically, the detail itself is tied to the pixel count on the screen. The blog also confirms they no longer necessarily need artists to create normal maps for detail. Essentially, in normal game development workflows, a high detail model is created first of a character, and then because it's so expensive to run in real time, especially with other stuff going on screen, it's a bit different with a cutscene. The higher quality model is essentially turned into lower quality versions, and then the higher quality is then basically mapped onto the lower quality model using a normal map. To be clear, this is not the same thing as the model running with more geometry. This is fake. Normal maps are essentially, I guess you could say, textures which have fake detail which can more accurately represent how the higher quality model looks. But if you've any interest in gaming, especially if you're a PC gamer, you'll likely be familiar with the term LOD. Naturally, as a PC gamer, you can crank up and down texture quality, geometry, and other graphical elements to allow the game to scale and run at higher frame rates on less capable machines. So a 2080 Ti could run a title at 4K between 60 and 80 FPS, but that same game can still run at let's say 1440p on a GTX 1080, but maybe you crank down a few of the detail settings to get much the same frame rate. With graphic settings LODs, you can think of that as selecting the upper limit of a quality setting that the game can render assets in, like an upper limit, but instead, we are referring here to developers needing to create several versions of models, and then the engine itself chooses which model to show on screen based on, once again, view distances or other criteria which developers can flag. Think of it this way: if you're close to a particular object in real life, you'll be able to see more detail than further away. Much the same could be said for a game as well. The further you are away from an object, the less detail you would even be able to see because there's fewer pixels which represent it. If you're aiming at a dude on the other side of the field in Battlefield 5, do you really need to worry about the engine having all of that geometry detail and having all of that stored in memory? No, you're just wasting resources. So, there are ways to introduce additional detail in surfaces such as tessellation, where you can break down geometry into smaller elements. Don't want to confuse things, so let's just keep things simple here. The problem is, though, when authoring all of these detail cut down models, it puts a lot of work on developers, who then, as Epic point out, or for various detailed versions of that same character, and it just takes time. That's where Nanite comes in to play for graphics artists. Tim Sweeney actually commented on this with an interview with gamesindustry.biz. The other aim, and perhaps the bigger aim, is to make content creators more productive so that you can build next generation games with a small team and produce incredibly high quality results without vast budgets, i.e., to put it in other words, games of similar sizes to current generation could be created by smaller teams, likely more efficiently, as well as being faster to create. And if teams were to scale as large as they are with current AAA titles, the huge, intricate game worlds could be created. And because UE5 handles virtual texturing, if you pull in 8K textures, several of them for any object, we can see unprecedented levels of detail. With Nanite running, we can actually have one pixel be represented as a single triangle. This is just incredibly impressive. I'll go deeper into the I/O aspect of this in a separate video, as I'm aware that this is already getting pretty lengthy, and frankly, I'd rather dive into the whole SSD system as a whole in the future anyway. What I'm trying to get at here is that the next generation of software is going to be a radical jump as we see a reduction in pop-in, lower resolution textures, improvements to lighting, and, well, instead, it's going to just allow developers to do subtle things to improve atmosphere in a scene. Take this scene from Shadow of the Tomb Raider with hardware ray tracing from Nvidia's RTX. On the face of it, do you get it? Brick faces? Face of it? Okay, I'll stop now. Anyway, it doesn't look that impressive compared to something like Control and its reflective windows, or even this scene with the pyres, but I want you to take a closer look at the brickwork here. The subtle detail greatly adds to the scene, adjusting how shadows fall and bounce even in the divots of rock and brickwork. This is ignoring the other benefits of the next generation, such as drastically improved game world sizes, which aren't broken up with massive loading screens, large improvements in physics, AI, and so much more. To give you perhaps an even better idea of where all this is going, let me read a quote from Epic's CTO, Kim Libri. And she says, this, by the way, was also another quote to games industry, "We felt that for a long time, games relied on static environments, not dynamic events, and everything felt just a bit pre-canned. So, we started to think about what next generation gaming is all going to be about. Fully destructible environments, fully editable environments, lighting that changes, time of the day that changes, details that look like a movie. This is a combination of getting things together in a tech demo that basically sets the ball rolling for all the amazing things we're going to put in to UE5. To wrap things up a little, I want you to imagine a scenario where you're playing a game. Let's say you're in a fairly dark, old abandoned building, and the enemy have perhaps a slight tactical advantage. They have more numbers than you. The building's dilapidated, it's decaying, but still, it's dark, and yeah, you just realize that you're going to get swarmed, so you throw a hand grenade. The grenade, I'm going to shock you here, it explodes. But imagine in this next generation world, where it doesn't just go boom and it kills a few enemies. No, instead, it damages the wall, causes it to crumble, and as you see the dust and debris start to settle, light, of course, starts trickling into the scene. You now are able to see the enemy much better, but so are they. And imagine just how different and dynamic this would be. The enemy AI would start to react differently because, well, now they can kind of see you, but also perhaps you're in a more tactical advantage because they are also outflanked by perhaps another teammate that now can see what the hell was happening in the scene, and now they can perhaps provide some covering fire. This is just an example. Ultimately, open world games will also benefit massively, being able to traverse an open world at huge speeds, no longer constrained by concerns of being able to feed data into the system fast enough. And this, as always, brings us full circle, back to Uncharted 1 on the PS3. Uncharted 1 was an impressive feat given the lack of knowledge at the time the team really had to maximise the performance of the machine, but naturally their work was dwarfed by their latter achievements. And Well, Sony and Microsoft have learned many lessons over the past few generations. And ultimately, the next generations of machines are designed to be relatively easy to start out with. After all, no team wants to just smash their face against a wall while they try to learn how to even, well, code at all for their system. With SMT disabled, they have, well, fewer threads to worry about. And while they also have a clock frequency advantage to boot, this means that developers, theoretically anyway, are, well, able to get up and running faster with whatever engine they're using. And given most game engines are only designed to scale to 8 CPU cores at the moment, obviously with the current generation of consoles, it makes sense to just be able to port code over easily, especially in the transition period between two generations. But naturally, you do have all of those additional threads if a developer wishes to use them. We also have the GPU, which is, well, much wider than the PlayStation 5's GPU. It's going to take time for developers to truly maximize it. On Sony's console, though, the geometry engine, I'm told, is going to be the linchpin to really maximize the performance of the GPU, as it's responsible for things like culling. This can be done in an automated fashion. The geometry engine could just be left to its own devices. But to truly maximize what it's capable of, yeah, developers are going to want to tinker with the code. And this is going to benefit open world games or just about any genre, but also VR as well. So if you're a PlayStation VR developer, there's a good chance that eventually, to really take full advantage of the machine, you're probably going to want to delve in to the geometry engine. And of course, even the Tempest engine, which can be used, of course, for sound, which is its principal purpose, but many other things in compute, at least according to Sony. Ultimately, the purpose of this video was, yes, to give an overview of UE5 and some of its cool features, but the real purpose was to go over some of the issues that games developers have and how the next generation of hardware and software will aim to fix them. Unreal Engine 5 is really cool, and I'm looking forward to seeing what other features Epic have included in the engine. After all, they've only demoed a couple of them, and there's damn sure more than just those two. But other engines like Unity will also change and adapt for the next generation, and that's to say nothing of in-house engines that, let's say, Microsoft or Sony's teams are using. Ultimately, I'm extremely excited to see what the next generation of hardware is capable of, and I think it's going to be an incredible time to be a gamer. Anyway, hopefully you have enjoyed the video. If you did, then of course you can, well, give it a like, which will help out a ton, and you can also subscribe to the channel for much more content. You can also follow us on social media. There's both my personal Twitter handle in the description box, but also the RGT Twitter, so you can follow both if you so desire. On my own personal one, though, I more ramble about like gym stuff and other crap that interests me, and obviously the official RGT Twitter is more tech related, so give either or none, whatever you choose, a follow. And of course, there is also Patreon links. If you want to support us, that would be amazing. And you can also find us on Amazon affiliate links too. So if you're buying something on Amazon and use one of those links, it helps us out. And of course, that's one way to contribute to the channel without costing you anything further. With all of that said though, I've been Paul, and I hope you've enjoyed the video. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.